Now that you've decided to start a podcast, your next step is to decide the type of show you want to produce. There are several different formats to choose from, and making this choice early on will help to guide your planning process. Let's start by taking a look at the solo podcast option. This is a podcast with one host, presents the topic for each episode. This is one of the easiest formats to start with because you just need a microphone and expertise in a particular field. But it can be a challenge for you as the host, since you'll be talking alone for each episode. You'll need to be able to provide enough content and be engaging enough to keep an audience interested. When you're doing a show by yourself, you'll be more efficient in terms of production since you don't need to coordinate with any guests, and you also have complete control over the content and format. But the downside to this is, solo podcasts may lack the variety and diversity of perspectives that interviews or co-hosted shows have. And they can also be more difficult to produce consistently without the support of other people. Also, you have to be able to hold an audience's attention all by yourself, and that can be difficult for some people. Which brings us to our next show type, the co-hosted option. This is a show with two or more hosts, and a lot of times, each host will play a specific role. For example, one host may read news snippets while the other leads a roundup segment. If you're doing this type of podcast, keep in mind that you'll need more coordination and communication between you and your co-host. Unlike a solo podcast, there will be a lot more editing and post-production work than when you're recording with just one person, which we'll get into in a later video. But at the same time, co-hosted podcasts can be more engaging for listeners, and it gives you a support and accountability system. Is this style the right choice for you? If you're willing to work with a team or at least one other person to share the workload, this is a solid choice. Another popular format is the interview style podcast. If you're thinking about doing an interview style podcast, it's important to keep in mind that this format requires a lot more preparation and coordination with people outside your team because you'll need to schedule and plan with your guests in advance. Also, the conversation may be less predictable than a solo show because you won't have complete control over its direction. Like I mentioned with the co-hosted podcast, editing and post-production will need a little more work since you may need to cut out awkward silences, off-topic tangents in the conversation, or just some regular old stumbles. However, interviews can provide a more engaging listening experience for your audience. In the end, whether an interview-style podcast is the right choice for you will depend on your goals and resources. The last format I'm going to talk about is the storytelling podcast. This type of podcast tells a story over several episodes. The story can either be nonfiction, like a true crime podcast detailing a complex case, or something completely fictional where characters adventure through a long plot line. It may use a narrative format similar to an audiobook or a dialogue-heavy format like a role-playing game. Storytelling podcasts can be highly engaging and immersive for listeners because they offer a compelling narrative that unfolds over time. They can also evoke strong emotions and create a deep connection with the audience. This type of podcast can be a good way to showcase your creative writing or storytelling skills and to differentiate your show from other types of podcasts. The downside to this, though, is storytelling podcasts can require a lot of preparation and planning because you need to develop a cohesive story arc and ensure that each episode builds on the previous one. They can also be less flexible in terms of content and format since you'll need to maintain continuity across multiple episodes. So how do you decide which format to go with? Let's recap the options and look at the pros and cons to help you decide which option is best for you. Solo podcasts can be more efficient to produce since you don't need to coordinate with any guests or interviewees. Although they could be less appealing to some listeners as they may prefer the variety and interaction of an interview-style show. Co-hosted podcasts can provide support and accountability for the hosts, as you can share the workload and responsibility for the show. But they may be less flexible in terms of content and format, since you need to consider the interests and perspectives of multiple people. Interview podcasts can provide a more engaging listening experience for your audience. This format is among the most popular because it relies on the guests rather than the hosts to provide the content. The downside is the conversation can be less predictable with less control over its direction. Storytelling podcasts can be especially engaging for podcast listeners who want to know what happens next. They also require a lot of preparation and planning, and you need to maintain continuity across multiple episodes. Whatever you decide to do, just remember that there's no wrong choice. Whatever you feel is best for you is the correct one.